This presentation is brought to you by the MFOA.
Hello everyone, welcome to MFOA's webinar entitled The Dedicated Leviers Case Studies of Commitment to Capital Funding. We have a very good cross-section of members attending this webinar today from small to medium and large municipalities, so we welcome you all. MFOA is presenting this webinar to provide finance staff with an overview of dedicated capital levies as a vehicle for supporting their asset management and infrastructure needs, including in-depth examples and advice, and to examine a few variations of the theme of dedicated levies. Emily?
Thank you, Gurjeet. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We have Desiree Kennedy, the City Treasurer from the City of Kingston, and Patty Elliott Spencer, the Director of Finance and Treasurer, City of Mississauga, as well as myself moderating, Emily Harris, the Manager of Policy and Intergovernmental Relations at MFOA. And a quick note to the audience to say that we would have loved to have a smaller municipality represented, but since many of the municipalities that currently use a dedicated levy modeled theirs off of one of the two municipalities on the line today and explicitly reference Kingston or Mississauga when explaining their levy, we figured it would be beneficial to hear from these two sources themselves. And we're very pleased to have Desiree and Patty here with us today. This webinar is the latest in MFOA's research series on infrastructure funding. It started out with a survey about municipal techniques to quantify the local infrastructure deficit. The next three projects that we'll be rolling out over the next few months include tracking funding performance through a scorecard that can be used to evaluate capital funding performance year over year, as well as in comparison to other municipalities. Secondly, the various communications tools and tips, for including a template that municipalities can repopulate their municipal logo, their municipal website, and the pictures and messaging in the central area will remain the same. So it's very much a template in the true sense, as well as tips to treasurers on how to communicate about infrastructure. And thirdly, an inventory of revenue and cost recovery tools so that municipalities have the options spanned out of own source options for raising revenue as well as recovering their costs for capital. And finally, in terms of the introduction, this work came at the request of MFOA's Finance Policy Committee, and we're extremely grateful to this group of volunteers for scoping and refining this set of deliverables I've just noted off. And furthermore, it was their interest in dedicated levies that sparked the idea for this webinar. So thank you again to this very prescient group. We have 94 people with us on the line today who shared their interest, so thank you for voicing that. Municipalities can commit to their capital program through a range of funding strategies, and we'd like to profile one such strategy that's gaining ground in the province: dedicated capital levies. The municipalities we have with us today have been the birthing grounds for innovative and well-known levies which have spin-off levies in small and large places across Ontario. Our entry point for this webinar is that everyone in the audience wants to learn how to implement a dedicated levy, so the tone reflects how to get that done. Okay, the agenda. First, we'll kick off with the drivers for these new round of capital levies. Second, we will differentiate dedicated capital levies from dedicating part of the levy for capital. Third, we'll head into the different parts of a levy and what makes it up. Fourth, some of the common entry points as well as evolutions in capital levies around the province. Then we'll do two case studies, one for Kingston, one on Mississauga. Finally, we'll wrap up with some implementation considerations, leading practices, and standard contact information for the speakers if you have further questions about their presentation materials. So, the drivers. The first few of these are quite standard. Of course, there is less external financial support for infrastructure. Replacement needs are clumped together. There is a past practice of deferring maintenance and replacement costs amid budgetary trade-offs. We have new information from public PSAB 3150 and more recently municipal asset management plans. And of course, the scale of the needs relative to the size of the assessment base requires that there be some kind of substantial building over time. A few other points, though, are that in order to improve funding performance, it's important to set the capital funding stream apart from the annual budget deliberations to the extent possible. Of course, these are a highly contested set of debates, and to some extent, we have the infrastructure we do and the gaps we do because of the very contested and negotiation-based nature of these debates, that important items can easily be taken off the table. Next, transfers to capital as a line item are not that sexy. There's a need to isolate and differentiate this new need for greater investment. Another point is that with more adopters, there is less political pressure to reduce or cancel the levy on the part of the municipalities that do adopt it now. And finally, it can be considered as part of a debt management strategy in many places that are cautious of their debt levels. So, many Ontario municipalities were born from 2005 to 2008. That's something I found just by researching this a bit online. And other than the municipalities listed in the speaker's notes section, can anybody write into the comment box here, the chat box, any other municipalities they know of that use a dedicated capital levy? I'll just give you a second for that. We'll wait until 12:09. Thornbury was one I just heard of the other day that I didn't know used a dedicated capital levy. Okay, Brampton, Kitchener, Newmarket, Thunder Bay. Excellent. Excellent. Okay, those are great to know, and we'll keep those as part of our notes. Okay, now the next section of the webinar is devoted to differentiating capital levies from dedicating part of the levy to capital. And the reason for this slide came up because when I was calling around after I'd typed in a few variations of Ontario municipality and dedicated capital levy, dedicated infrastructure levy into Google, I would call around, and there seemed to be a few municipalities that thought that, you know, given the flexibility of the definition of a dedicated capital levy, that they were in this school, but I guess I would consider it more as just maybe increasing their contributions to reserves rather than setting out a levy apart from the general tax levy. So other areas of differentiation would be the novelty, of course. It is dedicated levies are a bit of a branding strategy to meet increased needs, or increased knowledge of needs, I should probably say, over and above status quo capital budgets. And of course, versus the standing funding framework. Another thing that differentiates capital levies are where and when they come up, and usually there's a multi-year commitment in place, even if it's approved annually. The basis for the funding level, this again very subject to municipal purposes for their dedicated levy, but it can be based on projections of long-term funding needs and more of a macro approach. I think we might see more of this now that we have the asset management plans that identify exactly what those long-term needs are, so there's a target in sight. Of course, the basis for the funding level in the budget is project-based, variable, and what gets approved, essentially. And the last key point of differentiation is the degree of political influence exerted. And you can never completely get away from how politicians decide to collect and spend public money. They can change policies, they can do various things, but there is some degree of political insulation with a dedicated capital levy relative to dedicating part of the levy for capital. So these are just some generalizations. They do not hold true in every case by no means, and I think they just helped get a better understanding of what's new about this approach. And something I was thinking about when I was doing my research for this webinar was municipality could just triple their capital budget. What's the difference there? So I think there are a few things to note. As long as everything is up for debate altogether, you're not necessarily going to get that insulation. The second point is sticking within the same process doesn't recognize that something about that process is how we got to this place we were at to begin with. And because of it, that now there's a need to go over and above. So it's kind of like last year when the federal government said that their spending targets, they didn't meet this year's spending targets, or savings targets, my mistake, of $3 billion, say. But next year, they were going to get $15 billion in savings. So there's that element. But also, the packaging and the novelty serves a bit of a public education purpose. And it starts out with a public understanding of what the problem is. So in that context, the multi-year commitment to a dedicated levy attracts a bit more profile and media attention, which can enhance the levy's longevity. Okay, and an observation I'll make at this point is that now that MFOA has included public engagement in its understanding of what municipal financial sustainability means, there's a lot more discussion with finance officers about it. And something that I've noticed is that as a school, we're very conditioned to think in terms of performance management, performance measurement, and that tends to translate into when we think about engaging the public in terms of municipal outputs. So, we do X, we do Y, and it's harder to measure what the outcome is in terms of public education, and it might look more like attendance at meetings and voter turnout than things the municipality does directly. Okay, anatomy of a levy. For this slide, I just want to point out that this is not a linear diagram, but wherever you start, it's a good idea to bring the public in early. They can torpedo this if they didn't understand or if they didn't feel included in the process from the beginning. So just a bit of a description of each. In terms of public education, turning the public into levy champions. So this has to do with a pitch, including key stakeholder groups, publicity about the problem. In terms of genesis and purpose, how did the levy start? What were the preconditions that were in place that allowed the municipality to go with the levy it did? Purpose, council buy-in. So what kinds of messages were council hearing at the time? What convinced them to adopt the levy? Specific trigger points are useful. And I've given some examples here in the speaker's notes about perhaps it was a weather event, perhaps it was a first year of a new council, perhaps the new asset management plan identified a deficit and suggested an annual rate increase, and the municipality decided to address it through a dedicated levy. And then the last two, about amount, basis, amount, and how and when it's passed, relate to ironing out the financial and procedural details. So background research on needs, annual and long-term funding targets, what the structure of the levy is, yield, the basis, duration, timing, when it comes up. And just for your reference, the case studies here today will focus on the how-to bubbles from roughly 2 to 7 o'clock. Okay, how they start and how they evolve. So a few common entry points from the research indicated that special levies for a single capital project. In particular, hospitals were very popular as a way of starting a capital levy. Now, some of these have grown into generalized capital levies, and once the hospital debt was paid off, they just moved in with a different kind of levy. Many have just gone for the single project approach as well. Another entry point has been a tax room freed up from the provincial municipal fiscal and service delivery review upload, or pooling if you're in the GTHA. Also, the long-range financial plan, a road needs study, or an asset management plan can suggest a capital levy as a way of addressing the needs it spells out. And finally, yes, it is correct. I haven't mistyped this. A councillor or levy, or ratepayer group rather, has suggested a levy in at least one place. And it was a ratepayer group in one place and a councillor in another. So this can happen as well. Next part is about some observations on changes and mitigation strategies for levies. So just so everyone is clear, there aren't really foregone conclusions to be made on the levy, because it might be tempting to say, well, okay, council's going to adopt it, and then in 2 years it's on the pavement. But some have been eliminated, yes, some reduced, yes, but some increased, some doubled, some multiply. So there's not one trajectory. If it lasts longer than 4 years, it can become a part of the furniture. So the conversation turns into one about how to get it over that 4-year hump and plan for any of the questions and debates that happen around it then. So 2 strategies for getting it over the 4-year hump are, 1, start small with a project-based or an asset-based levy, and 2, build in some cushion so if any trade-offs are made, the whole thing doesn't go to pot. And lastly, in the case that the levy doesn't withstand an election, there are still compounding benefits that many municipalities have realized. Okay, so now Desiree Kennedy is going to present a case study on Kingston's levy. And the levy there is part of a multi-pronged approach to increasing capital funding, which includes more money from general taxation as well as user fees, and there's an interesting tie-in to the credit rating. So, Desiree?
Thanks, Emily. Thanks very much for that introduction. It was interesting because I had not looked at your slides, but it's interesting how some of your research links into some of the experience that we've had here at the City of Kingston. In terms of what I wanted to present today, just a bit of an agenda, so I thought I would talk a little bit about how it started, our dedicated levy started at the City of Kingston, how it works today and how it's been working. And then I thought I'd sort of gone back into a bit of history and in terms of how we've been able to garner both council support as well as the public support with respect to this levy, some of the messaging that we use today. And then just sort of rounding out, it's a little bit more than just our capital levy, some of the other capital funding strategies that we have, and where we sort of see going in the next probably 10 to 15 years. So in terms of how it started, and as Emily said, there's usually a number of factors that can sort of start these types of levies in terms of a kickoff. For us, it was an amalgamation. So the City of Kingston was amalgamated into the new City of Kingston on January 1st, 1998, and that was 3 former municipalities that came into the new City of Kingston, including the former city, and 2 of the larger townships out of the county of Frontenac. So from that, there certainly was a lot of review in that first year in terms of some of the challenges that we had as a new city going forward. And part of those challenges, there was probably 4 fundamental ones that were identified, in addition to some of the extraordinary expenses that we had to deal with from the amalgamation and transition costs, We had, as you'll remember, most will remember, we had an ice storm that first couple of weeks in January. We were dealing with some provincial downloads, some assessment issues. So we had a number of operating type budget issues that we were looking at. We also identified a significant capital backlog with respect to an historic pattern of inadequate investment in the capital asset portfolio in past years. And so we identified a need to develop some capital planning strategies specifically that addressed not only the catch-up of capital investment, but looking forward in terms of how we were going to maintain, replace, renew existing assets, and how are we going to build the capacity for new capital to support growth into the future. So in response to that, we developed a capitalization policy in 1999, and that policy included the introduction of a 10-year capitalization plan, so a 10-year capital budget with funding, and a strategy to move towards pay-as-you-go. So within that just meant basically having the money in our reserves before we actually were spending it on the capital. That was going to involve certainly progressive increases in contributions from our operations to the capital reserve funds to build those reserve funds up. They were at very low levels upon amalgamation. And it also involved responsible use of debt as a transitional tool until we could get to that place where we wanted to be mainly pay-as-you-go. And I can tell you we're not there yet. This is back in 1999, and certainly plans change as you go forward. But that has been, since day one, our strategy is that we would work towards a pay-as-you-go strategy for our existing assets for maintaining them. In terms of how it works, so we just a bit of a picture there that shows how our capital funding works. And Emily mentioned about segregating or being distinct between your capital budgets and your operating budgets and dealing with them separate. And that's certainly what we attempted to do in the earlier days with this. So what we do now and what we've been doing since 1999 is the transfers that are going from our operating budget to our capital reserve funds are being increased each year by a 1% tax rate increase. And so that is accumulating each year. The 1% applies to all of our taxation, includes our general municipal, as well as our special area rates, which we have in fire, and payments in lieu as well. So 2014, our levy has actually grown to about $27 million now. And you can see how we have segregated in that picture. It shows that we have money coming in from tax levy and other resources is going into the capital reserve funds, and then all of our capital is now funded either pay-as-you-go, so cash out of the reserve funds, or by debt, particularly if they're new assets, and then those debt charges are funded from those same capital reserve funds. So the only thing going through our operating budget is that annual transfer to capital, and then it's set aside. And this was our 2014 levy. So you can see in Kingston we have about a $200 million tax revenue, and so 1% brings in about an additional $2 million. The other thing that we've done more recently, and we have not done this back from day one, but we've also included an inflationary increase. So when we're looking at our budgets and we are trying to get our operating budgets down now to just an inflationary increase plus the 1%, we've been using part of that inflationary increase against the capital investment. So our 2013 levy was just shy of $25 million. We've added another $2 million onto that with the 1%, plus we added on 2% of the 24.8, which gets us up to the $27 million. The inflationary just depends on the situations that we have. We were able to do that for 2014, but that's certainly one of those discretionary areas, and sometimes it will just be the $2 million or whatever the 1% is. So you can see where that's built up to about $27 million now. So in terms of council support, so I went back, talked to a couple of the previous treasurers who are still here, just to get a feel for how did we get the support of council? So we're into about year 15 now. We've gone through probably about 5 or 6 different councils. And so I went back to see how did we actually do this? How did we sell it on day one? And how did we maintain that support from council and from the public? So certainly in the earlier years, post-amalgamation realities, presented to council, the capital backlog, the aging infrastructure was presented to council, and we got an endorsement of a 10-year capital plan. And I think that's probably one of the key points that we've seen right through since day one, is it's really important to have comprehensive capital plans that go out at least 10, maybe 15 to 20 years, so that council can see what the benefits are of the levy. So it's not just kind of money coming in, but they're seeing where it's going out. And certainly getting their endorsement of that 10-year plan in 1999 certainly helped to cement some of that levy strategy going forward. We continue to talk about with council and with the public the benefits of capital infrastructure and the benefits of enhancing and renewing and maintaining them, to quality of life, to community competitiveness, to economic development and growth. We've also, in terms of, as I mentioned, it's really important to have comprehensive financial plans. Not only is this good in terms of being able to show the benefits of the levy and what they're going to get in future years by having that money coming in, but it also provides greater transparency and accountability both to council and to the public, and helps to support priority setting, which I will talk about in a moment, but that certainly has been an important strategy with respect to the levy and in terms of our capital programs. So currently we have 10-year capital plans. We are this year actually embarking on extending those to 15-year capital plans across the corporation, and that includes funding models, so reserve fund models, as well as our debt models, and of course they all interrelate. Those are all presented to council, and they are endorsed by council. So one of the things that we have learned is it's really important to bring council along with you as you're making these plans, as you're identifying priorities, that they're involved in it and that they understand some of the consequences if you add things on, add spending on, what does that do to other spending and other things that have to come off. The debt parameters, and this was something that Emily had mentioned in her introduction, because it all does link into your debt management strategies. And that is something that we introduced probably about 6 years ago to council, and we now provide it probably a couple of times a year. We provide information on what our debt levels are. We set a ceiling for council, so we have the ministry ceiling, that the debt repayment limit that they give us. Certainly we weren't comfortable with going that high. We've set a ceiling for ourselves internally that's probably a little bit less than maybe half of that ministry parameter, which has been endorsed by council. So council, and we provide them with models that show, based on our plans and based on what we think we're going to have to issue in debt, here's what the debt looks like. And we provide, going out 15 years, provide in terms of where they might be going out or going over those parameters in the out years and some of the challenges. So it doesn't always look great, but it's putting that information in front of them so that they can see that. And certainly the asset management plans, we are, like a lot of municipalities, have been, we've got a lot of individual plans. We've worked for the provincial deadline of trying to pull together corporate asset management plans. And our plan is to update all of our capital plans in 2014, and I expect some of the asset management plan work that we've done will certainly be reflected in those updated plans. So a couple of other things that we've done in terms of trying to garner council support and to maintain this levy, as I mentioned, and having an enhanced focus on your capital requirements that's distinct from operations. So we bring two very distinct budgets, and except for that link of the money coming over on an annual basis into the reserve funds, they are very distinct. and that certainly helps council in terms of dealing with them individually and seeing the importance of the capital as a separate strategies. We've also introduced, about 3 years ago, we introduced 3-year operating plans and budgets. And the reason for this was to, again, have our corporation, have our departments thinking longer term so that we could work to stabilize our operating tax increases that were necessary to fund the operations. And we have been able to get to, the last 3 years, to a position where our operating budget is basically inflation plus our 1%, and then our growth is funding any enhanced or new service levels that we might have. So we've been able to stabilize that, and by planning longer term, if we can stabilize that, I think that has made the 1% a little bit more acceptable in terms of the overall tax rate increase. And finally, the other thing that we have done, we have a new strategic plan that came into effect in 2011 with the current term of council. 2 things that are within that. One, we do have one of the 6 priorities of council, which is to maintain and enhance infrastructure. So we've got council support that this is an important initiative, that we do have to invest in our infrastructure, and there's a lot of activities and workflow around that within the plan. Second, we incorporated right within our strategic plan financial parameters. So they're endorsed by council. This is council's strategic plan. And it had tax rate increases, which specifically included the 1% for capital right within the strategic plan, as well as the commitment to remain within those tolerable limits for long-term debt. So those limits that we had set that were tolerable for us. So the just some additional messaging that we were thinking about, and some of the things that we're doing, and we incorporate this wherever we can, particularly into our council documentation and council reports that are public. So things like promoting capital investment, promoting new capital projects that are out there, so that the taxpayers can see the benefit of that money that's come in and where it's being invested. I've talked about the long-term planning, and I can't emphasize that enough, the importance of that, as well as the importance of priority setting. So when we go to council with these plans, they know that we have a limit in terms of what's in our reserve funds that we can either pay as you go, or we can use for debt charges, but those reserve funds are what they are. There's no more going in there except what's coming in on an annual basis. We also know that we have a debt limit, and when we hit up to that ceiling, we can't go any farther, and we are actually very close to the ceiling. But one of the things that we do with that is, one of our strategies is to utilize the principal repayment room. So we're saying to council, we don't want to go over this, but we pay about $15 million a year in principal repayment, so that opens up some room. So it's just a strategy. We also use cash flow with respect to when we actually issue the debt, again, just to keep us underneath that line. So we have some parameters that council is used to and used to dealing with. So at the end of the day, they know that we've got to set priorities. We can't afford to do all of it, and it comes down to setting priorities, and that's part of our strategic planning sessions that we hold with them every year. The last message that we have also used is our credit rating with Standard & Poor's. So Standard & Poor's certainly reviews in great detail some of our fiscal practices and our strategies, particularly around the 1% and our capital plans and funding models. And that financial rating has increased steadily over the time frame that we've had the 1% in place. So that's just another message that we like to put out to council and to the public in terms of the favorable rate increase that does link back directly to the 1% as one factor. The other strategy that I just want to mention that sometimes isn't quite as obvious that we have done with respect to our policies is with respect to fees and charges. So in most cases, services have fees associated with them that are also subsidized in various proportions by tax revenues. So for instance, our transit service here, we have a strategy to fund approximately 50-50 between user fees and taxation revenues based on individual benefit versus community type benefits. So to ensure that you maintain that proportion, we have to make sure that our fees and charges bylaw is consistent with the 1% taxation policy. So as taxes are going up by inflation and by the 1%, so are the fees and charges. So our fees and charges bylaw actually lays out an annual increase by inflation plus 1% for the capital investment purposes. So if inflation is 2%, the majority of our fees and charges are going up 3% if there's a capital element involved. And then finally, in terms of, can't sort of talk about just the 1%, but certainly as with other municipalities, we have other capital funding resources that are all built into the plans and the models. So certainly for new growth and community expansion, the strategy is not to use the 1% for that. Certainly we have the development charges and our impost fee bylaws that assist with the new growth, and the debt capacity is used for any kind of expansion, community expansion and increase in assets, so that the 1% is normally dedicated to our existing assets and maintaining that asset base. We also have utility rates that do provide for full cost recovery for the utility-related infrastructure. So there is no tax-based component for our utility infrastructure. However, they do utilize the city's debt capacity. So again, it's a consolidated plan. So looking into the future, certainly we have the levy endorsed by the current council to the end of this current term. There will be, in terms of orientation for council later in December and into January, this will be an important component of that orientation and explaining to the new council why we have the 1%. It is always at risk, as Emily said, when after 4 years in the new council, it certainly is at risk of disappearing. We are hoping to continue it, and it'll be an important component of our next 10 to 15 year capital plan update that we are doing now. We've got a lot of master plans being updated as we speak. We've got our DC and impost bylaw background studies that are underway. So we've recognized 2014 as being an important time period to update those plans, and certainly those plans will make the assumption in them that our 1% will continue probably for about another maybe up to 10 years. I'm hoping that as we get some of this updated capital information, including some of the studies that are being done in the DC and impost, that going out in the next 15 years, we will be able to show where we will no longer need the 1%, and that we will get to an optimal investment level that's going to be dictated by the development of some of these plans, including our asset management plans. Definitely our strategy will be to continue to support an increased use of pay-as-you-go with respect to capital reinvestment and a reduced reliance on debt. Just in terms of a couple of summary messages, you can't do it all at once. You definitely need a phased-in approach. You need to have these 10 to 15-year plans so you can see what things are going to look like and what the effect of these different strategies are. And so it needs to be supported by those comprehensive long-term plans. Transparency and accountability will definitely garner support. So something we've probably done in the last 5 to 6 years is we've really made an effort of putting this information, the full planning information, in front of council and getting them involved, getting their endorsement on certain things, including putting it in our strategic plan. Be diligent in prioritizing the projects. So we keep saying to council, we can't do it all and we have to prioritize. And be diligent in terms of rationalizing the need for capital assets. So we've done some work on, do we really need to have all the assets that we've got? Are they all in use? And even do we need to, we look at the service levels, are there services that we shouldn't be in? That as a result, if we weren't in those services, we wouldn't need the capital. So the last slide is just some resources that I've put here in terms of that I thought might be of use. One of the things that will be coming out in April for those that get the Public Sector Digest, we actually have an article that's coming out in the April edition that one of our council members has written with respect to this capital levy. And it actually links back to an article that was in March where Kingston was named one of the 3 Canadian cities that made the top 7 list of the most intelligent communities. And we've been able to link some of that, those efforts to our 1% levy. So stay tuned. That should be coming out in April. And then I've just done some links to a couple of our reports and our strategic plan on the website. These are just samples of things that have gone to council and that do reference in one way or another our 1% levy. And I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Desiree, for sharing that information about Kingston's experience with the dedicated levy. Now we'll turn it over to Patty Elliott-Spencer to give us some insight into Mississauga's debt and infrastructure levy. And as a bit of a sneak peek, their levy was part of an intergovernmental strategy for advocating for more transfers, and it involved significant communications to the public. As well, an interesting aside, the debt and infrastructure levy is one of 3 dedicated levies in Mississauga. So, Patty?
Okay, thank you, Emily. This afternoon I'm going to talk to you basically about the history of Mississauga's infrastructure levy and its evolution into an infrastructure and debt levy. As Emily noted, we do have actually 3 special levies right now, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those. And then I'm going to conclude with just talking about how we sustain our dedicated levies and how we communicate to the public. Before I get into the next slides, I did want to give you some background specifically on how we go about our budget process. We do have a comprehensive business planning and budget process where we prepare a 4-year operating budget, and we also have a 10-year capital plan that is based on a detailed prioritization process. I'm not going to really talk about those items today, but I just wanted to give you that as a background before we get into the levies. So Mississauga is relatively a young city, especially compared to Kingston, I think. Anyway, we will be 40 years old this year, so we are maturing. We're getting to be about middle age, I guess. Our infrastructure currently is in a very good state of repair, but like most municipalities, our infrastructure is starting to age and it is going to deteriorate if it is not properly maintained. Back in 2006, city staff began informing council of this situation. We identified this graph and it was presented to council. The red bar showing how our state of good repair expenses are increasing. The beige bar at the bottom actually represents the amount of funding that we're currently raising in 2014 for capital needs. So back in the 90s and through the 2000s, the city of Mississauga had fairly significant tax-based capital reserve funds. But as you can see, that situation started to change as we got to the end of the 21st decade of the 2000s, and our reserve balances were declining significantly to the point that in 2012 we were looking at having a balance of $30 million, which we were planning to maintain as an emergency fund. We've subsequently amended our policy and moved that minimum balance up to $100 million. This capital reserve forecast, when it was shown to council, indicated that we would need a new funding strategy than what we had been using in the past, because without it we would not be able to fund our state of good repair work. So based on this information that was presented to council back in, this was late 2007, City Council approved in principle a 5% infrastructure levy. Now this was meant to be a one-time 5% increase in the base that would then be dedicated for capital funding. This happened to coincide with a federal fall economic statement where the GST was reduced by 1%. So the strategy was that the room that was created by the reduction in GST of 1% would make having the 5% levy affordable by our taxpayers. There was a very large public campaign that was undertaken by the city, which involved meetings with various ratepayer groups, also with the Board of Trade, with federal MPPs. We also utilized the mayor's newsletter to residents, and I believe there was also a video that the mayor had available on the website that residents could watch. Ultimately, in the spring of 2008, City Council approved a 1% infrastructure levy, and this was meant to be a 1% increase each and every year going forward. So the premise of the levy was changed. This levy was also approved in 2009, but in 2010, due to economic conditions, the levy was not approved. So this slide just shows how our 1% levy works. As you can see, each year we've increased the amount of funding that we raise through our tax levy by 1% with the exception of 2010. You can also see from this chart that even over the 10-year period, we do not make up our funding gap. We are approaching $60 million in funding, whereas our identified needs are closer to $100 million a year. So this is definitely not a short-term funding strategy. This is a long-term funding strategy, and I think we've identified that we're looking at least 15 to 20 years before we can actually close the gap. So even though we do have our infrastructure levy, we started educating council on what our real infrastructure gap was. When PSAB came in, we had our annual amortization costs, and we would present those to council, but we also wanted to show council what our actual costs would be in replacement dollars. So the red bar is actually the amount of money that we're raising through our operating budget in 2014. The gold bar is our annual depreciation costs based on historical values. So we're funding about 25% of our amortization expense. When we go to our replacement costs, which is close to $350 million, I think we're funding approximately about 10 to 15% of our annual replacement costs. Therefore, we still have a long way to go. And we are currently in the process of developing a comprehensive long-term financial strategy and financing plan. As part of that, we are looking at other policies, which we hope to present the new council early in 2015. And one of the items that we are looking at is that each time a new project goes into service, as part of its incremental operating cost, the amortization cost would be funded. So for every new project put into service, we would have to start making a contribution to reserves, and that would be over and above our infrastructure levy. So Mississauga was famous for being debt-free for well over 30 years. So in 2012, Council did approve the issuance of debt for the first time in 30 years. We did have debt way back in the 70s when we were first incorporated. Our infrastructure levy was revised to a 2% infrastructure and debt levy to correspond with the issuance of the debt. The way that this works is that on average 1% of the levy goes to grow the contribution to capital, and another 1% goes to cover new debt charges. In a year when we don't utilize the 1% for debt, that money also will go into the contribution to capital so we can leverage it up even more. However, even with our 2% infrastructure and debt levy, we do still have over $800 million in unfunded needs. So that is part of the basis for our long-term financial plan and all of the different policies that we've been looking at. We have managed to have this 2% infrastructure levy approved in 2012, 2013, and 2014. And as part of our business plan and budget, where we do the 4-year future view, we show it each and every year as a separate item in those forecasts that it needs to continue. So as I noted at the beginning, we have now expanded our use of special purpose levies based on the success that we've had with the capital levy. The capital levy seems to have been well accepted by council. We discuss it each year, but it basically is something that I think that they have come to accept and do understand that it is required to support our capital program. In 2013, the city did identify a program to deal with the emerald ash borer. Our forestry group did a great deal of research and determined that an investment of $53 million over 10 years to treat some trees would actually be more cost effective than not doing anything. This was a significant impact on our budget, and therefore to ensure that we had a dedicated funding source that actually could be eliminated at the end of this program, City Council approved a emerald ash borer special levy of 0.8% on the property tax, and it was increased again by 0.8% in 2014, and that gives us an amount of $5.6 million per year. That levy will remain in place as a dollar amount levy until the program is fully funded. In 2014, the University of Toronto of Mississauga approached City Council for a $10 million contribution to the construction of a new innovation center at the Mississauga campus. City Council has approved that as a special levy of $1 million per year for the next 10 years. In order to sustain these levies, our levies are subject to approval by council annually, as I think most are. We do make sure that the purpose of our levies is tied very specifically to the needs, so there's a clear nexus between what the funds are being raised for and how we use them. We show them separately on our all of our budget presentations. They are separated out from all of our other operating expenses and are clearly showed as a special levy. By doing this, I just think it makes it much clearer and much easier for council to accept and approve the levies. I also think it's much more acceptable to the public because they also can understand specifically where the funds are going. Basically, in sustaining the levies, the message would be to communicate, 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 which leads me to my last slide. So we do a great deal of communicating to the public. We started with our City Nows campaign back in 2007, explaining to the public our need for infrastructure funding. We have developed a comprehensive infrastructure brochure which councillors can hand out at public meetings. There is a special button on our website which will lead residents to that brochure, and it does explain the amount of infrastructure we have and how we fund it. Our mayor's newsletter that is sent out with tax bills always devotes a section to the funding of infrastructure and the need for infrastructure funding. We now provide separate disclosure on our property tax bill that shows the actual dollar amount that you are paying for the infrastructure levy and for the emerald ash borer levy. On our city website, we do have videos that have been developed by the mayor regarding our budget and by infrastructure. And we also have a budget video which tries to explain to the public a number of budget issues, but also deals specifically with our infrastructure levy. And basically that concludes all of my slides. I was trying to focus just on the infrastructure levy. So Emily, it's back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Patty. And on behalf of everyone on the line, we're all jealous. Okay, so we'll head into some implementation considerations and best practices before taking on the 3 questions that have come through to us on the chat box. So, if your municipality is considering a levy, here are some of the essential decisions, and foremost among them is what problem is the levy designed to overcome? So in terms of purpose, it can be a major project, a specific asset class like roads or wastewater that might be underfunded, maybe more its life cycle for you, and it's the maintenance and the replacement needs that are mounting and not being addressed through standard measures. Also, new needs like stormwater management can be addressed through this type of a levy measure. The decision of whether to phase in the levy or use a flat rate is also one to consider. The duration, in terms of are you going to define a finish line or not, knowing that the needs just grow, and so there are pros and cons to moving to a project completion or a defined finish line or kind of an in perpetuity levy. The basis. I know today we've heard about percentage levies, but I believe Patty mentioned also the University of Toronto and Mississauga campus is also a dollar value per year. A few other examples in that vein are that Marmora and Lake charges, I think, $35 this year per house, and Thornbury charges $200 per house. So there are a few different ways to set this up. And in terms of mediating the tax impacts, another option that municipalities can consider is refining their deferral, cancellation, and tax relief bylaws and policies. I believe right now the mandatory classes to include in those policies are measures to insulate seniors and persons with disabilities, but perhaps a broader span of mediation of tax impacts can be part of the transition. In terms of leading practices, just with the last few minutes here, it's the public relations element of a dedicated levy can't be overstated. Just an example of this is, has anyone on the line heard of the vehicle registration tax? And I'm not seeing anything come up in the chat box, and that's there's good reason for that. It was short-lived. The City of Toronto implemented a vehicle registration tax, and many people said the implementation of it was quite quick. And then the next few years later, someone ran on a platform of getting rid of the vehicle registration tax. He won. We have no vehicle registration tax. So PR about the problem that the levy is designed to address is important to lead with. Breaking out capital levies on property tax bills, that can also serve as part of the ongoing process of separating, isolating the levy to the extent possible and wherever possible. Obviously, levies revenue should flow into separate reserves. Another point, though, is to reflect progress on the purpose of the levy publicly. So I'll just skip ahead. Before we'd confirmed the speaker series for this webinar, I found this in a presentation that Mississauga did, and so this is just another way of reflecting progress in eating down the infrastructure deficit. And Patty also mentioned that in Mississauga's next council term that they'll be introducing new councillors with the policy about putting away money in reserves the year after a new asset comes on board. And so that's what I've called here the Oakville lesson. If anyone knows Nancy Sully in Oakville, she'll tell you that after they plan on retiring their levy, the plan is to start saving for replacement costs immediately after. In terms of some could-dos, a referendum is a common U.S. measure. We don't hear it a lot in Canada, but if there is some degree of public support and it's more political barriers that you're looking to address, a referendum can be a good way of getting a municipal mandate for more infrastructure spending. Area rates, which are used, I think, Kingston, as Des mentioned, also in Ottawa and a number of places around the province. They can also be part of the mitigation strategy for implementing a levy. And including inserts into the tax bill. This is becoming more and more common. For example, Halton includes an infrastructure report card in with its tax bill. There's an example of another type of performance reporting in the MFOA virtual library on our website in terms of an insert. And just to follow up on what Patty was mentioning earlier with the Mississauga video about the infrastructure levy, We're happy to put that on MFOA's YouTube channel just as an example of what some of the messages sound like. Okay, so the takeaways here revolve around the problem that the levy addresses. So a specific kind of infrastructure, whether it's your backlog or deficit, whether it's life cycle needs or growth, those were defined in the PMF SDR exercise as the 3 drivers of infrastructure investment need. If there are particular asset classes or services or new needs that that need to be addressed, they can be part of the problem statement. Also, anything to localize the deficit, like weather, like specific political priorities, changing demographics, economic development strategies, anything in that vein. The second is a question about how to build support for the levy to weather an election. So some things to consider here. I'll just throw out a few questions, and the answers to these questions are inherently local, which is why we don't get into any detail, but who else knows about the problem? Some town halls, radio spots, YouTube videos, newsletters, infrastructure committees with citizen participation, press releases, that kind of thing. How much do people know about the problem, and how do they benefit from capital investment? How much lead up to implementation was there? So I've thrown out a minimum of 60% of the time filling the airways should be about the problem rather than we're going to implement a new tax. Another question is who owns the levy? If it's really slated towards the mayor or towards council, it's a good thing to think about how to get naysayers on board publicly in advance of the election. And reaching out to ratepayer groups directly and meeting with them to allay their concerns is also very important. Thirdly, set up a brand that resonates with locals. So you can play with the title, the consultation and implementation process, how it's presented, key messages. I know Scugog has, I think their council term themselves the Taking Care of Business Council, so that could be used in some kind of a levy name. Build Belleville is the name of a campaign around Belleville's asset management strategy. I made up the Turner Bridge levy, but if you're a municipality that has a lot of bridges and limited means, setting up an asset class specific levy might be something to consider, and a possible levy for flood or storm relief is also conceivable. So the key takeaway here is what's yours about it. And if the message can be transported and apply equally anywhere, there might be more compelling ways to tell the story that enhance local ownership and longevity potentially. Okay, now we will turn to the chat box for questions, insights, and tips. Gertie, would you like to read out the first question?
Thank you, Emily. The first question is, how do you maintain the integrity of the original purpose of raising funds for capital replacement and minimize or avoid funds being used by councils and department heads as a slush fund or piggy bank for pet projects, aside from just establishing a reserve fund through bylaws?
Well, our capital budgeting process involves a fairly in-depth prioritization process, and our operating or our business planning process also requires the justification of any new types of funding. The risk associated with not doing a project, all of these things have to be identified, and they are reviewed by the leadership team, which is, I guess, similar to your executive management teams, and presented to council as the recommended program. For things to get side road, I think we work fairly well together. I mean, there may always be political pressure for there to be special projects, but we try to very clearly explain to council the situation in terms of where we're at with our state of good repair, and that we need all the funds for the purposes that we've assigned it to.
Thank you, Patty. The next question is, how does depreciation expense accumulated amortization reserve work with a capital levy?
So I can jump in on that. So I think when we're looking at the capital levy, so that's the revenue coming in, which creates the transfers to our reserve funds. What we do is we do analysis similar to what I think Patty had on her slides with respect to are you bringing enough funds in to at least cover your depreciation? So your depreciation is sort of your proxy for the use of those assets based on a historical cost. And certainly if you do it based on a replacement cost, it's going to be a lot higher. So one of the things that we do is a comparison on that to ensure that we have enough transfers going into our reserve fund for capital to at least match our depreciation based on historical costs.
Thank you, Desiree. The next question is, what is the legal basis for charging a tax levy based on a dollar cost per household?
So for Kingston, it was not related to a cost per household. It was strictly based on the total tax levy. So we have not gone there at all in terms of linking up to an actual cost per household. Now we do report it that way. So we report in our annual report and on our tax bill inserts sort of the cost per household of each service area. And we actually show our capital levy as one of those areas so that people can see they're putting about $300 a year towards the capital levy, and that's by household.
And ours is the same way. Ours is a general levy upon all, rateable property. We don't do it as a dollar amount per household, but as I noted, we do show on each individual property tax bill the dollar amount included in your property taxes that is going to capital.
Thank you, Patty. Desiree, I think there's a follow-up to this. Isn't the key to protecting the restriction on a capital levy to get it embedded in your bylaws, which then makes it harder to reallocate?
Well, I can respond to that. I think, it is part of our budget bylaws. But I guess, at the end of the day, council can amend those bylaws whenever they want as well. So I'm not sure just the process of including in the bylaws particularly helps in terms of garnering that support or the long-term support on council. But they are part of our budget, and so they are identified separately within our budget bylaw.
I think there are two questions that have come up in the chat box that I think would benefit from some insight from our provincial colleagues, and they relate to an upper tier levy and specifically the legal basis for the dollar value per household in the case where it's X per household. So to address those, we will move into the discussion forums once we've spoken with the province. So that's where the answers for those questions will be posted. And if anybody else on the line has any questions, feel free to type them into the dialogue box now, just while we're waiting. Desiree and Patty, would you do anything differently if you were in a small municipality? And if so, how would your approach reflect that different environment?
I can start with that. I don't think at the end of the day I would do a whole lot that's different. I think it's really about having those plans in place, doing that long-term planning, and as Patty said, it's about communicating to the public so that they understand not only what the levy is for, but what you're going to be doing with that levy and what the benefit, what the outcome is of it at the end of the day. And I think, it doesn't matter what size of municipality you are, I think those are important factors in terms of the success of having a levy.
And I would agree with that. I think good, sound, long-term financial planning applies no matter what size of an organization you are. So I totally agree with Desiree.
Okay, perfect. That's great. Thank you very much for those questions. And no more have come into the dialogue box, so we'll close off that section of the webinar. And a webinar evaluation will be sent immediately after we're done here. So we would love to improve through your feedback. So please do fill out the evaluation. And lastly, it's a standard part of any webinar. Here are the email addresses for our presenters today, and they would be happy to take any additional questions from members of the audience who would like to follow up with them on specifics. Thank you very much for joining us on the line today. And like I said, if anyone is interested, we can continue this discussion on MFOA's newly launched discussion forums, especially if you're interested in the legal basis for a $1 per household levy or the ability of upper tiers to implement a dedicated levy. And those are questions that we will have the answers to by the end of the week and post them online. So thank you very much again to our presenters and for everyone on the line.